The valley lay open to the wind, its grasses bending like old supplicants, its ridges carved by storms older than memory. Clara Bennett stood at the edge of her porch with her shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, watching the sky darken. Thunder rolled low across the distance, carrying with it the smell of rain and iron. A lantern flickered behind her, but she did not move toward it. She had grown used to shadows. Her homestead clung to the earth like a scar that refused to heal. The house was small, its boards gray and weather-beaten, patched by her own hands since the accident that had left her a widow. The barn leaned slightly, stubborn against collapse, and the corral fence sagged as if it carried grief too. Every corner of the place whispered of her husband, the tools left to rust, the rocking chair that once creaked under his weight, the rifle standing against the wall though it had not fired in years. Clara had grown used to silence. At night it stretched over her like a heavy quilt, pressing into her lungs. By day it followed her through the fields and the kitchen, through the motions of milking, grinding, mending. Silence had become her only companion, and she wore it as one wears an old coat, threadbare, but familiar. It was into this silence that the rider came. The sound of hooves startled her dog before it startled her. The animal barked, low and uncertain, and Clara turned her head to see a figure breaking through the curtain of approaching rain. He rode with a steady, measured pace, his hat pulled low, his coat marked with dust and travel. The horse beneath him looked as weary as its master, ribs showing faintly in the dim light. Clara stiffened, her grip tightening on the shawl. Strangers brought little but trouble. A woman alone could not afford to open her door to every drifter who crossed the valley. She waited as he dismounted, his boots sinking slightly in the softening earth. When he lifted his face, lightning carved his features in pale relief. A scar across one cheek, sharp as a knife stroke, and eyes that carried shadows deeper than storm clouds. "Evening," he said, his voice quiet, careful, as though he feared to break something fragile between them. "Name's Jonah Hale. I don't ask more than a place to see the rain through. Your barn will do. I'll pay in labor if you've got need of it." His tone was steady, but she heard something beneath it. Weariness, perhaps, or a kind of humility not common among men who came riding into a widow's yard. Clara studied him a long moment. The storm edged closer, lightning stuttering over the ridges. She could send him away, and perhaps she should. But something in his stance, the way he waited without stepping nearer, without forcing his presence, made her pause. "The barn," she said at last, her voice even, though her heart thudded against her ribs. "Not the house." He tipped his hat, the gesture respectful. "That's fair." Without another word, he led his horse toward the leaning structure. Clara remained on the porch, shawl tight, watching the storm gather its fury. The first drops began to fall, tapping against the roof like fingers. She sat in the rocking chair, pulling her knees closer beneath the shawl. The chair groaned under her, a sound too familiar, one that echoed nights when her husband had rocked there after long days on the range. The memory came sharp, almost cruel, and her eyes drifted toward the barn where the stranger now moved in the half-light. Through the open door she saw him stripping the saddle from his horse, his movements slow but practiced. The smell of wet leather and hay drifted across the yard, mingling with the sharp tang of ozone. The horse whickered softly and Jonah murmured something to it, words too quiet to reach her. She turned her eyes away, to the length of braided rope hanging beside the porch. Once it had tied her husband's tools together. Now it hung frayed, unraveling, a symbol of use long gone. Her gaze lingered on it until the rain blurred her vision. The storm broke in earnest. Rain lashed the roof, hissed against the shutters, and filled the air with a roar that swallowed the valley whole. Lightning flashed, illuminating the land in stark, fleeting brightness, then plunging it back into darkness. Clara rocked slowly, her shawl dampening at the edges, her thoughts circling like restless birds. She thought of men who left. Men who promised steadiness and delivered absence. Men whose words faded like smoke in the wind. She had learned the hard way that to lean on another was to invite the ache of abandonment. Better to keep her walls high, her heart wrapped in silence. In the barn, Jonah moved with patient rhythm. She could hear the faint sounds, The scrape of a pitchfork, the thud of hooves settling on straw, the low hum of his voice as he worked. He asked nothing more of her. Did not come to the porch. Did not test the line she had drawn. He was there, yet not pressing. A presence she could almost forget if she chose. Almost. As the hours dragged and the storm raged on, Clara remained in her chair, shawl pulled close, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The air smelled of wet earth and old timber, of rain pressing life into the dry roots of grass. Her heart beat steady, though unease wound through her like thread. She was not ready to admit it, but part of her was strangely relieved the barn was not empty tonight. That the silence she wore like armor had been cracked, however slightly, by the sound of another soul moving just beyond her walls. Still, she told herself, the welcome was cold for a reason. Tomorrow the storm might pass, and with it the stranger. Best to remember that. Best to guard the ache of her heart, for storms always passed, and riders always left. Yet as thunder rolled and the rocking chair creaked, the thought whispered in her. Perhaps not all storms were meant to sweep everything away. Some carried in their violence the seeds of something waiting to grow. Morning broke pale and thin, the light slipping through torn clouds like a hand searching for purchase. The storm had passed, though its breath lingered in the damp earth and the swollen banks of the creek. Clara rose before the rooster, shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her hair braided in a hasty knot. The house smelled of smoke and wet timber, a reminder that even walls could absorb sorrow if they stood long enough. She moved through the rooms with careful steps, as though each board remembered. Her hand brushed the scarred workbench by the door, her fingertips tracing grooves worn by her husband's hands, hands that once swung hammers and lifted saddles, hands that had held her waist in the kitchen while the stew simmered. Now the wood bore their memory more faithfully than flesh ever could. Against the far wall leaned his rifle, barrel rusted, stock cracked. She had oiled it once, out of duty, but let it fall into neglect after. A weapon was no comfort in the night when grief gnawed the edges of sleep. Beside the rifle, the cedar chest sat shut, yet its weight pressed on her heart. Within lay her wedding dress, folded with care she had not shown to anything else in years. White once, now yellowed by time, smelling faintly of cedar and faded lilac sachets. She had not lifted its lid since the burial. Every corner of the homestead held him still, yet not in flesh, only in reminders, as heavy as stones. Outside, she found Jonah already at work. His coat was slung over a fence post, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. The fence had sagged after the storm, one post leaning out like a weary soldier. Jonah's hands moved with the rhythm of a man who knew timber and rope. He worked in silence, not asking, not intruding. Clara stood for a moment on the porch, watching as he dug the post hole deeper, set the wood, and tightened the rails with the patience of one accustomed to labor done without praise. When he saw her, he nodded once, nothing more. His scar caught the early light, and she thought it looked less like a wound than a mark life had carved to prove he had endured. She did not thank him. The words sat on her tongue but would not pass her lips. Gratitude opened doors, and doors led to expectations. She could not risk that. Later he fetched water from the well. She watched him lower the bucket, pull the rope hand over hand, the muscles of his arms flexing with each pull. He did not look toward her, did not speak unless spoken to. His silence was different from hers. Hers built walls, his carried secrets. She wondered what ghosts he kept buried in it. By midday the sun broke through, and the valley shone with a wet, clean light. Clara set out walking her land, her boots sinking in softened earth. Jonah worked still, mending, checking, keeping his distance. She carried her loneliness with her, as one might carry a child too long born, heavy, unyielding, yet impossible to set down. It was on the ridge above the creek that she heard hooves. A neighbor, Mr. Tully, approached at a trot, his hat pulled low, his horse's sides flecked with mud. He reined in by her fence, his face creased with unease. "Mornin', Miss Bennett," he called. "You've heard?" "Heard what?" "Families camped down by the river, natives. Come north after being pushed from their grounds. Folks are uneasy. Some talk trouble." Clara's breath caught, though she did not show it. Images rose unbidden. Winters of fear when raids struck, barns burned, and cattle were stolen. But woven among them was another memory, a woman with dark braids and softer eyes than most, who had once come to Clara's door in the dead of winter. She had carried herbs wrapped in cloth, medicine for a fever that had near taken Clara to the grave. No words had passed between them that night, only the silent offering of one woman to another. That face lingered now, cutting through the harsher recollections. "I'll keep watch," Clara said evenly. "Best you do," Tully muttered. Tipping his hat before spurring away, Clara stood a long while by the fence, the weight of memory pressing her shoulders. Unity and division blurred in her heart, as though rain had smeared the lines between kindness and fear. When evening fell, she lit a fire and sat on the porch, shawl draped loose, the flames casting shifting gold against the yard. Jonah sat some distance off, sharpening a tool he had found among her husband's old things. The rasp of stone against metal carried in the quiet, steady, unhurried. She studied him in the flickering light. His face looked carved from shadow, all planes and scars. Yet there was something in his stillness that spoke louder than motion ever could. His eyes were fixed not on her, not even on the blade, but somewhere inward, a memory or regret that held him tight. Clara recognized it, the look of a soul who had lived too long with ghosts, who carried them as constant companions. Her own ghosts stirred at the sight, as though reaching toward his, neither spoke. Words would have broken something fragile between them. The fire cracked, the night deepened, and silence drew around them like a shroud. But it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was a silence shared, a silence that admitted the weight of the past without asking either of them to confess it aloud. For the first time in years, Clara did not feel utterly alone in it. The second storm came without warning. Night had settled soft and black across the valley when the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of iron and rain. The sky split open soon after, a jagged line of white fire tearing the clouds. Thunder shook the windows of the cabin and sent the chickens restless in their roost. Clara woke in her rocker, shawl sliding from her shoulders, the taste of copper in her mouth. By dawn, the land was drowning. The river that usually crept lazy through the bottom fields now surged with a fury that seemed intent on reclaiming everything built against it. Mud swallowed the edges of the pasture. Fences groaned. The barn quivered in the gale. Clara stepped out, boots sinking deep, her breath already stolen by the storm's wild roar. The livestock had to be checked, storm or no. She hitched her small wagon to the mule, urging the animal through sheets of rain. Water slapped her face, plastered her hair to her cheeks, and soaked her shawl until it clung heavy as chains. She pressed forward, jaw clenched, determined not to yield ground. But the earth was treachery itself. Near the swollen bank, the wagon's wheel sank deep, twisted and overturned with a violent lurch. Clara cried out as she was flung into the churning flood. The water was ice, colder than breath, colder than grief. It dragged at her skirts, spun her under, pressed her chest with hands of stone. For one long, terrifying instant she did not fight it. She let the current take her, its dark embrace pulling her down. Perhaps, she thought dimly, it would be easier to let go. Easier to rest where silence was final. But then arms broke through, strong, unyielding, fierce. A hand closed around her wrist, the grip iron-clad, refusing the river's claim. She surfaced with a gasp, rain slashing her face, and through the blur she saw Jonah. His hat was gone, his hair plastered black against his scarred cheek. His teeth clenched as he dragged her inch by inch toward the shore. "Hold on," he growled, breath ragged. "Don't you dare let go!" The river fought to tear them apart, but Jonah's grip did not falter. His boots dug into mud, muscles straining as though the earth itself resisted him. At last they collapsed on the bank, coughing, choking, shivering against the sodden grass. Clara curled against the ground, every bone aching, her lungs burning. Jonah leaned close, water streaming down his face. His voice was hoarse, raw, cut through with something deeper than mere urgency. "I'm not letting go again." The words pierced her through, strange, weighted, more than rescue, more than duty. Something in them hinted at another story, a wound older than tonight's storm. Yet they lit a spark in the hollow place inside her, a warmth she had not felt since before the graveyard claimed her husband. She stared at him, too cold to speak, too shaken to ask. But her chest trembled with more than shivers. He guided her up, steadying her, though his own body shook. Together they stumbled back toward the cabin, rain lashing their backs, the storm raging without mercy. Each step was heavy as stone, but Jonah's hand never left her arm. Not once did his eyes wander away from her, as though if he let her out of his sight, the river might claim her still. Inside, the fire had long gone out, leaving the room damp and chill. Jonah knelt at the hearth, striking flint until sparks caught, coaxing flame into life with a patience born of necessity. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket he pulled from the cedar chest, her body trembling as though she had carried the flood inside her. The fire grew, licking light into the shadows, filling the cabin with the smell of wet wood smoke. Rain battered the shutters, each drop a drumbeat against the walls, and the roof groaned under the weight of it. The world outside was fury. Within, only their uneven breaths broke the silence. Clara watched him in the shifting glow. His scar gleamed faintly, the cut of it harsh, yet softened by the firelight. He sat back on his heels, water still dripping from his shirt, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she felt not intrusion, but shelter in his presence. Not the shelter of walls or roofs, but of something steadier, rarer. Her lips parted, but no words came. She wanted to ask what he meant, again. She wanted to demand what promise had been broken, who he had once abandoned, what ghosts he carried that weighed his voice so heavily. But she did not. Not tonight. Instead, she let the silence hold them both. She let the fire warm the ache in her chest. Jonah settled near the hearth, leaning back against the wall. His eyes closed briefly, as though exhaustion had finally claimed him. But even then his hand rested on the rifle he had cleaned earlier. As if his instincts would not permit him to release guard, Clara sat across from him, the blanket pulled close, the storm's hiss filling her ears. She realized with a start that she was breathing easier than she had in months, maybe years. The storm might rage all night, but she no longer faced it alone. Outside, the river thundered on, swollen and merciless. Inside, something fragile had begun to stir, not yet trust, not yet forgiveness, but the faintest thread of it, stretched between two souls who had nearly been swallowed whole. The river did not relent. Days stretched grey and sodden, the banks swollen beyond recognition, the road washed out, and the fields drowned in water that gleamed like steel beneath a low sky. Clara's homestead became an island, cut off from neighbors, from town, from the thin threads of community she had only half belonged to since widowhood settled on her shoulders. Jonah remained. At first it was necessity. The storm had wrecked the land, and no rider could pass without risking the river's wrath. But necessity turned to routine, and routine soon became a quiet rhythm, neither spoke of, but both obeyed. Each morning Clara lit the lamp before dawn, grinding coffee with steady, unhurried turns. The smell filled the small house, rich and bitter, masking the damp scent of the swollen valley. Jonah would already be awake, though he made no sound until she set down a cup. He accepted it with a nod, his scar catching the lamplight, his eyes lowered in respect rather than presumption. He worked where work was needed. The latch on the barn door had splintered in the storm, and he mended it with iron nails scavenged from her husband's old stores. He trimmed the branches that pressed heavy against the roof, chopped wood until neat piles grew beside the porch, and brushed the mud from the mule's coat with slow, careful strokes. He never asked permission, yet he never acted as though the place were his. Each task was performed with the patience of a man who had little else to offer but labor and silence. By evening, they found themselves beneath the same roof, drawn to the fire that pushed back against the damp chill. The flames cracked and hissed, smoke winding up the chimney. Clara sat in her rocker, shawl wrapped close, while Jonah leaned against the wall, his long frame folded in quiet repose. Their silences were not empty now. They carried the weight of something shared, though words remained scarce. Still, tension hummed like a wire stretched too tight. Clara's heart warred with itself. She remembered every promise broken by men who swore constancy then rode away. She remembered nights of waiting, days of silence that turned to years. Trust was a door she had nailed shut, and Jonah's presence, steady as it seemed, pressed against it in ways that unsettled her. Jonah carried his own battle. She saw it in his gaze when the firelight caught his face. Shadows flickering not only across the scar on his cheek but deeper, etched in the set of his jaw, in the heaviness of his shoulders. He was a man pursued by something within, and though he held it at bay, it clung to him like the damp hung to the valley. One night, when the rain pressed harder against the shutters than usual, Jonah spoke. His voice was low, uneven, as though dragged unwillingly from his chest. "There was a woman once," he said, staring at the fire. "She should have had more from me than what I gave. But war and whiskey, they got hold of me. I left her when she needed me most." The crackle of flame filled the long pause that followed. Clara's hands tightened on her shawl. He went on, his words halting. "I carry her absence same as I carry this scar. Not just on my cheek, inside. Ain't a day I don't feel it." Clara's breath caught. Anger stirred in her, not at him, but at the familiarity of it. She knew too well what it was to be left, to be failed by someone who had sworn to stay. The ache of recognition cut her deeper than his confession. For a moment she wanted to send him from her house, to bar the door against his ghosts and hers alike. But she remained seated, shawl tight, her eyes fixed on the fire. Because she also knew what it was to live with regret that never loosened its hold. "I reckon we all carry scars," she said finally. Her voice soft, brittle. Jonah looked at her then, his eyes shadowed yet open in a way she had not seen before. He did not reply, but in his silence she heard more honesty than in any vow she had ever been given. Days later, news drifted in on horseback. Mr. Tully, soaked from the rain, rode close enough to the porch to deliver it. "Cattle raiders near the river," he warned. "Settlers say it's the native camp. Tensions are high. Folks are talking about riding out." Clara felt her chest tighten. Fear rose like smoke, curling and choking. Memories of barns burning, of shouts in the night, clawed at her. But another memory cut through. A braided woman's quiet eyes, herbs pressed into her hands when fever had nearly ended her. Kindness and threat, blurred together like rain-streaking glass. When Tully rode off, Jonah remained by her side. He didn't speak, but his presence filled the space like a shield. She bristled, drawing her shawl closer. "I can fend for myself," she said sharply, though her voice trembled. Jonah's eyes softened, though his jaw stayed firm. "Maybe so, but you won't have to." The words unsettled her more than threats ever could. She turned away, unwilling to let him see the heat in her cheeks, the crack opening in her carefully built walls. That night, the fire burned bright against the storm's howl. Clara rocked slow in her chair, eyes on the shifting coals. Jonah sat nearby, watchful, protective in a way she had not asked for but found herself unwilling to refuse. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was heavy with truths confessed, scars revealed, and the fragile beginnings of trust neither had believed they would ever give again. The night was still when it began. The storm had passed days before, leaving the land damp but quiet, the river swollen yet calmer in its rage. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of Jonah's presence, his steady movements in the yard, the sound of his boots across the porch, his silhouette against the firelight when evening settled heavy. Silence between them no longer bit at her. It had begun instead to feel like something shared. But that night, silence was broken by the crack of gunfire. Clara woke to the sharp report, followed by the panicked bray of the mule. Before her eyes could adjust to the dark, the smell of smoke struck her, bitter, suffocating. She rose at once, pulling her shawl around her shoulders as flames licked the edges of her barn. Fire raced along dry timber, climbing high, shadows leaping like devils across the yard. Jonah was already on his feet, rifle in hand. He pressed past her toward the door. "Stay inside." But Clara snatched her husband's old rifle from where it leaned against the wall. Her hands shook, but her voice did not falter. "I won't." The yard was chaos, Fire snapping and spitting, sparks raining across the dry grass, smoke choking the air. Figures moved in the dark, quick and shadowed. Raiders. She could hear their harsh shouts, the clash of hooves and boots as they circled like wolves. Jonah fired first, a warning that echoed across the valley. Clara's breath came hard. Her shoulder braced against the rifle, her finger tight on the trigger. The firelight made every shadow a threat, every movement a danger. They fought side by side, her shots ringing sharp, his steady as stone. Sparks fell on their hair, smoke seared their throats, but they did not yield. For every shadow that lunged, Jonah was there, shielding her, pressing her back only when danger was too near. Then Clara heard the sound she feared most, Jonah's grunt, low and guttural. He staggered, blood darkening his shirt beneath the fire's glow. "Jonah!" The cry ripped from her throat before she could stop it. Fear surged in her, hot and blinding. She had sworn to keep her heart locked, but in that moment, the lock shattered. She could not lose him. Not this man who had pulled her from the river. Not this man who carried his own scars, but chose to stand beside her anyway. Her rifle cracked again, fierce and unrelenting. The raiders faltered under the resistance, shadows fleeing back into the dark. The fire still raged, but the worst of the threat had passed. Clara dropped to her knees beside Jonah, her hands pressing against the wound at his side. His face was pale, jaw clenched, but his eyes met hers steady. "I ain't leaving you," he said through his teeth. Tears burned her eyes, hot as the fire's sparks. "Don't you dare," she whispered, her hands trembling. "I won't let you." Neighbors arrived then, roused by the glow of flames. Among them rode men she knew from across the valley, Tully and his kin, but also figures she had not expected. From the far side of the river came native families, drawn by the fire's call. For a moment, the yard was a place of tense stillness, two groups who had long eyed each other with suspicion facing across the flames. Then, without word, they worked together. Buckets of water passed from hand to hand, blankets thrown across sparks, boots stomping out embers. United by necessity, they fought the fire as one. By dawn, the barn stood half in ruin, but the blaze was beaten back. Smoke drifted upward, gray and tired, into a pale sky. The yard was littered with ash and blackened timber, but life remained. The mule trembled but lived. The cabin still stood. Clara and Jonah, though marked with blood and soot, endured. Clara sat in the dirt, Jonah's hand cradled in hers. His palm was calloused, rough with years of labor and loss, but warm with life. She pressed it to her lap, her thumb tracing the edge of his scarred knuckles. In the glow of embers, she saw him differently than before. Not as a drifter who might ride on with the next season, not as a shadow carrying secrets, but as a man who had chosen to stay when danger threatened to sweep them both away. His loyalty was not a chain meant to bind her. It was presence freely given, a rare gift in a world where so much was taken. Jonah's eyes opened, pain etched there, but also steadiness. "You held fast," he murmured. Clara's voice was soft, fierce. "I won't lose another soul. Not you." The fire had devoured half her barn, left scars that would remain on her land. Yet as she sat there, his hand in hers, she realized something had been forged in the flames that no ruin could undo. She could not return to silence, not fully. The fire had burned through her walls as surely as it had burned through the barn. And in its ashes, she felt the first shape of something new. Not weakness, not chains, but the strength of choosing not to be alone. Jonah's wandering found root in that moment, and Clara's guarded heart found a flame that did not destroy but warmed. Dawn came pale and slow, spreading across the valley in muted gold. Smoke still hung in the air, drifting upward in tired ribbons, curling like the last of the night's ghosts, leaving the earth behind. The fire had blackened the barn to ribs of timber, half a skeleton reaching toward the sky. Yet in the ruin, there was a strange stillness, almost holy in its quiet. Clara stepped out into it, shawl wrapped tight across her shoulders. The ground beneath her boots was damp, ash clinging to the hems of her skirt. She paused by the fence, running her fingers across the charred rails, and let her breath move slow and steady. Something inside her felt different, though she could not yet name it. Jonah was there beside her, bandaged at the ribs but upright, his movements steady despite the wound. His scarred cheek caught the morning light. The line of it softened somehow, less a mark of ruin than of endurance. He said nothing, but his presence at her side filled the silence in a way that did not weigh her down. Neighbors gathered in the yard, voices low, their faces lined with soot and sleeplessness. Some spoke of mending what was lost, others of sending word for help. And among them, Clara saw what she had not expected. Settlers and natives speaking together, trading words without raised rifles, their hands still smelling of river water and smoke. Old divisions had not vanished in the night, but something had shifted. Necessity had bent them toward a fragile kind of trust, the beginning of something less brittle than hatred. Clara listened, her hand resting lightly against the frayed braid of rope tied around the tool rack, once her husband's, now nearly crumbled to dust. The past would not vanish, but perhaps it no longer had to bind her. When the neighbors drifted home, Jonah turned to his horse. He brushed its flank gently, the movement practiced, reverent. He saddled it slow, not meeting her eyes. Clara felt her chest tighten at the sight, for she knew what it meant. He was preparing to ride on, believing himself only a guest who had lingered too long. She stood still, the morning cool against her skin, the decision rising in her like a tide she could not turn back. Her fingers went to her hair. Slowly, deliberately she braided it, strand by trembling strand. The gesture was old, one she had not made since her wedding day, a mark of dignity, of choosing not to be undone. When Jonah turned, reins in hand, he saw her there with her braid falling neat against her shoulder. His breath caught, though he did not speak. Clara's voice was quiet, but clear enough to carry. I cannot promise you love, Jonah Hale, not yet. My heart has been buried too long, but I can promise this. You will not walk alone. His gaze steadied on her, something breaking and mending in the same breath across his face. He let the reins slip from his fingers, the horse shifting idly beside him. His reply was simple, steady, without flourish. Then I'll stay. The words carried no weight of chains, no scent of demand. Only truth, plain as river water, and Clara felt the first unshakable thread of hope tie itself through her chest. Later, as the sun climbed higher, they rode together toward the river. The land bore scars, black patches where the fire had eaten, but the air smelled of damp earth and wild sage. Clara's shawl fluttered against her arms as the horse moved beneath her, Jonah riding close by. At the riverbank, she dismounted, boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. The river still ran high, its waters thick from the storm, but no longer wild with rage. It coursed steady now, full of power but not destruction, a mirror of survival itself. Clara stood at its edge, watching sunlight catch the ripples, and felt her chest rise with something she had not carried in years. Not certainty. Not a promise of a life unmarred by sorrow, but hope, fragile, trembling, alive. Jonah came to stand beside her, his shadow long against the water. He did not touch her, not yet, but the space between them was no longer hollow. She could feel him there, as sure as the river's pull, as sure as the wind through the valley grass. The river had tried to take her, and the fire had tried to burn her hollow. Yet here she stood, her braid tight, her shawl warm against her shoulders, Jonah Hale beside her. The reckoning was not in what had been lost, but in what they chose to carry forward. And as the water rolled on beneath the wide sky, Clara knew she would no longer face the valley alone.